right, thank you too.
Thank you, dear professor. If there is another person who wants to ask a question, or if, okay, thank you. So we move to our next presenter from Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution from Mason University. It's Dr. Daniel Rothbart with the topic of power, emotions, and violent conflicts. Please, Dr. Rothbart, are you with us?
Yes, hello. It's such a pleasure to participate in this conference, and always a joy to follow my colleague and friend Richard Rubenstein. Always inspirational every time I hear him. I am going to share. Wow, so many options in sharing. Sorry for the delay. Do you see that?
Yes.
You see that? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Well, it's not only a pleasure to follow my colleagues, Karina and Rich, but it is just so exciting to now be, as it were, contributing to this conference on a topic that reconciliation in Ukraine, and obviously reconciliation by implication in other conflicts. This is a topic that of central importance that needs so much work. It needs so much analysis to examine its scope and obviously its depth. And I want to, just if I may, I've done a fair amount of work on identity-based conflicts with my colleague Karina Korostelina, and one issue that's central to identity is the sense of shared emotions. That emotions are obviously critical to bond people, the in-group together, and obviously to establish breaks or negativities to the so-called out-group. And I think that this topic is central to reconciliation. And I'm going to put on a timer. Sorry. Okay. And this, I want to suggest an emotional frame to reconciliation. It's the kind of thing that I think when you talk to people, when practitioners and people, as it were, in the field, as they say, talk to conflict actors, they observe clearly emotional intensity. But I don't think this has been analyzed sufficiently, in particular with respect to the radically innovative insights from social psychology. So just to begin very simply, we all know of very familiar reconciliation practices. I mean, just to mention a few: truth-telling, forgiveness, apology, sympathetic understanding, just to convey a few. And I think underpinning reconciliation is an understanding of emotional transformation, emotional transition, a radical shift in the emotional life of conflict actors. And I'm just today, for the few minutes that I have, I'm only going to talk about two emotions, because the field is so huge, and I think it just needs so much work. So I'm going to just offer a few words about a transition from rage to compassion. And I'm selecting rage as a part of the psychology of aggression. And very conventional models of psychology will show that the aggressive behavior is a result of situational factors and emotional responses. It's this combination. And there are these complicated models, which, you know, this is called the general aggression model in psychology, which involves a combination of many, many factors as the prelude or the preconditions for aggression. And one factor, actually, this model does not take into account a whole burgeoning study of the neuroscience of aggression, the neuroscience, basically, of anger. Amygdala is the region that is a region that's agitated when people feel angry. Okay, but in addition to that, and let me just stress here, there are some important recent findings in psychology about the sociality of emotions. So don't think of emotions as a momentary feeling, you know, like the thrill I have when I eat, you know, a great chocolate cake. That's not the kind of metaphor model. Rather, think of emotions in this context as a social psychological process. And relevant to our field, the kind of emotions that become at the forefront of, in particular, collective identity are moral emotions. So moral emotions, basically, um, represent one dimension of the politics of violent conflict. So there are positive moral emotions, we know, sympathy, caring, empathy, compassion. And there are, of course, negative moral emotions, disdain, hatred. Rage is a moral emotion. So in addition to that, the second point is that these moral emotions tend to be enculturated in the prelude to protracted violent conflict. That is, they're not just momentary feelings, momentary, as it were, psychic states that are privately embedded in the brain. They're enculturated, meaning people learn how to emote in accordance with the social norms, as if you want to say the ethos of society, and then they repeat that, culturally reinforced. Oh, sorry. The third point that psychologists have identified, have discovered, is that these social emotions are contagious. That when somebody exhibits a performance, other people tend to mimic them. And this is so obvious with political demagogues as it is with very inspiring religious leaders who give an emotionally intense sermon. It's emotionally contagious. So how does this relate to conflict analysis? Well, I think quite clearly there's an emotional life to nations at war. Let me say that again. There's an emotional life when to nations who are engaged in war. And this is obvious with collective glories, shame at defeats, rage at enemy actions, wars of revenge. A number of political scientists have documented this, or even something that as seemingly superficial as love of the nation. And I want to say seemingly superficial. It's not really, but it seems like it's innocuous. It's not innocuous at all when nations are at war. Emotional enculturation, well, as I say, it reflects society's ethos, influenced significantly by shared values, beliefs, and so on. By the way, I meant to stress at the beginning of my conversation here, my talk, this has so much to do with Richard Rubinstein's theme on tribalism. And I certainly support the point that tribalism from multiple political perspectives, it's not just the you know, the nativist right wing. But okay, so these emotions are enculturated, they're embedded in one's habituated practices, and they're prescriptive. Emotions are expected, encouraged, and in some cases rewarded. That's certainly the case when nations are engaged in war, and the emotional response of glory for the hero is expected, as is the emotional response of disdain for the enemy. And the third point, again, is contagion. Emotionally charged performances can spread in performances, political rallies. Contagion here means social mimicry. They can be shared in many different ways, both implicitly and explicitly. And this is just an example of the emotional response after 9/11 years ago. Um, and yet, yet I want to suggest that something that I haven't seen written anywhere is that these emotions have a kind of power that is that is inseparable from the structure of violent conflicts. That that the emotions that are intersect with a kind of affect power. And what I mean is that the power has all those three characteristics I just mentioned. The affect power has those three characteristics that I just mentioned. Just very quickly, the power is moralistic. And I know that sounds weird because we all think of power as amoral, or at least the classical realists have this incredibly narrow view of power as amoral. Well, it's anything but amoral among conflict protagonists when all of the conflict protagonists that I'm aware of invoke a sense of righteous indignation at the enemy's evil actions. I don't know of a case of any protracted violent conflict where the protagonists do not invoke a sense of evil doing and purity, as was a topic mentioned earlier today, a purity of the in-group. Second, it's enculturated. This is a power that reflects and advances the ethos of society. Rage becomes embedded in the classification between us and them. That is the very dynamic that Karina Korstalina was talking about regarding categorization. The dynamic is intensified by rage. Of course, there's many other emotions. I'm just using rage here as one example of many. And that rage becomes part of the mechanism of in-group bonding and out-group uh, demonization. And the affect power, again, is contagious. It's obvious in performance of constitutes manipulating tactics. The performance constitutes manipulating tactics of demagogues, tyrants, and dictators. Now, I'm particularly interested in recent months, or maybe even a couple years, I guess, in the resurgence of rage on multiple sides of grassroots movements. That rage has become a political instrument. It's obvious with candidate Donald Trump when he induced a collective rage among his supporters about the famous, the infamous, I should say, lock her up chant. And now we've seen it in the uh, global protests against the killing of George Floyd, where the protesters also express and exhibit rage. And this is just a quote: "I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm sick, I'm scared." And many people invoke rage. And interestingly, I even found in the United States an organization whose very title is Righteous Rage Institute for Social Justice and Community Organizing. Now, this is an organization whose primary mission is to redress social and political injustice, obviously. And I'm struck by this example of how they define themselves through righteous rage. This is emotional, it's moralistic, and it's clearly political. Rage also has fosters a sense of excitement, an individual feeling, which is entangled with a political struggle. My rage is personal and political, which not only validates my rage, and let me just add personally, if I may, when I watch or learn about conflicts, I succumb personally to rage and I try to control it. Sometimes I don't, as my wife will attest. But it's clearly political and it is self-validating. Nobody can challenge my rage. It's personal, but it's also political. It offers emotional capital, which can be converted to political capital under certain circumstances. As it were, me ranting on Facebook or one of the social media become political capital. But so I want to suggest that rage, it's kind of individual and it's collectivist. It's personal and it's social. It might be soft when I keep the rage to myself, but it could be hard under certain conditions of violence. Rage, again, the point here, rage is an emotional precondition to aggression. And here's a model. I won't have time to depict it, but I just want to indicate that we can analyze the intersection of emotion and power. This is an intersection of emotion and power through the combination of these dualities. Okay, now let me just make a quick and maybe too sharp a transition here to something that I think is critical for reconciliation, and that is the affect power of compassion. Now, I've never heard of anyone talking about affect power of compassion. I mean, I guess we've heard about the power of compassion, the power of love, and so on. But I think we should take this more seriously than a superficial, like a part of a greeting card for the holidays. I think that compassion should be looked at as it's clearly a moral emotion. It's individual and or it's collectivist. It's personal and social. It's soft, obviously, and it can be hard when compassion is selective, that only I'm compassionate for my people and not them. Okay, so compassion, just very briefly, there is and I want to stress, this is a moral emotion that's been well recognized literally for thousands of years, and it's also a power. There are four major thought traditions which have given insight into compassion. Obviously, religion, the Abrahamic faith traditions have placed compassion for suffering at the center of religious ethics. Moral philosophy, compassion is critical to the ethics of care, living in right relations. Social psychology, obviously, compassion means sympathetic understanding of those suffering and hope for their relief. And as I mentioned, also neuropsychology, humans are hardwired for compassion. Psychologists have recently discovered that compassion can actually be induced. And one of my colleagues, actually a participant in this conference, Mark Gopin, is one of the very few scholar practitioners who's advancing this theme. This is just a model of the location of compassion in these red indications. So what I think compassion offers is, as a goal, this is a goal to overcome mind blindness, to promote understanding of others as complex, vulnerable people, to probe similarities between them and us, and to really focus on the moral plane of life. Moral plane, as it were, refers to my rights and obligations in relation to others. The moral plane is relevant to my in-group bonding, and obviously it's part of out-group negativity or positivity, and compassion is critical for that positive relationship. And just very briefly, compassion, I think, is basically underpins one of the central values of peace building, and I do think conflict resolution. Quoting Bernard Mayer, our values are the source of our dedication and the compass that guides us, the essential glue of our field. And where do we find the value of compassion? Well, it's obvious in the human rights agenda. Any directive to protect the rights of vulnerable population group is an indication of compassion. It underpins conflict resolution practices with respect to the discursive norms of communication in a practice, and it's part of the ethos of some communities who are experiencing mass violence. And I'm talking about the local peace builders, many of whom, as it were, from grassroots movement, many of whom are organized by women. I have done a study on compassion among conflict actors. We just finished this study of students who are young people, students who are engaged in a peace education program in Italy called Rondine. This is a group of young people from conflict zones. They're engaged in a certificate program in peace building, 2 years. It's the most intensive, it's not just education, the most intensive transformation. It's an identity transformation, which involves compassion. And we have shown that many of them have exhibited compassion, but not all, interestingly. I won't have time to present the results of that. So I want to conclude by saying that the affect power of emotions is critical to conflict reconciliation. That the norm of compassion is central to peace building, as I mentioned. It rests on the emotional life of conflict actors, which I think needs so much more attention. One aspect of that emotional life, again, is compassion. That is the ethics of caring for the suffering of others. And it also requires, I think, very interestingly, when we tested the students in Rondine, it requires a kind of reflection on the actor's positioning in relation to others. That is, compassion, when people are asked about it, calls for a reflection on their relationship both to the in-group and to the out-group. And I will conclude here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was a very good presentation. I think it's very soft about soft power and how the power is not just hardness, but soft relations. And thank you, Dr. Rothbart. I would like to hear someone want to share or ask have some questions, please.
If I may?
Yes, we can hear you, please.
Professor Rothbart, in the framework of my research, I work with professional artists as well. And my hypothesis is that art would play a peace-building role if the artist paints the other in a way that drives compassion in the viewer. What do you think of the perspective of hypothesis?
Well, absolutely. I need to learn more about your study. And as I responded to your presentation a little while ago, I was very impressed with I don't think we should look at art as just a technique. It's more of a way of, well, you're the expert on it, but I think it leads to a deep reflection of moral relationships, of in-group and out-group. So I think it's very promising, and I'd like to see, obviously, more research on this in different contexts. So thank you for your question.
May I ask something? You work on compassion, and you showed briefly also difference to empathy in the brain. How did you realize this difference in your research, or how do you make this difference?
You know, I'm very struck by what I've given similar talks, and I think that question comes up each time, which indicates I need to address it more upfront. The answer given by psychologists is that empathy is a distinct psychological portion in the brain, as you saw from that model. And actually, there are studies that show that empathy can actually have a negative effect to acting. Empathy can actually lead to a psychic resistance to engaging with the people suffering. And so it's different from compassion. With empathy, as we know, empathy means that one has a kind of vicarious sharing of that experience. And psychologists have shown that that sense of sharing the experience is, of course, painful, psychologically painful. And of course, what is a common reaction to an experience of pain? It's to resist, it's to pull away. And in some cases, empathy has been shown actually to foster a kind of resentment of the person who is observed to be suffering. So compassion is not a vicarious participation in the suffering of other person. It's a positioning. What is my position, moral stance in relation to the person suffering? Or for in the case of reconciliation, what is my relation to the person, the so-called enemy? And I think the pictures that we saw from the previous speaker about the artwork, it was very visually clear about that position, moral positioning.
Thank you.
May I also have a question?
Yes.
How are such universal value as human rights or human dignity related with compassions? And how national memories is also related to the compassions?
Yeah. You're asking about how the other values are related to compassion? Yes. So compassion, Jonathan Haidt, who's the towering figure in moral psychology, talks about clustering of moral emotions. So compassion is clustered with certain other emotions, which means that they tend to be experienced together. So compassion, caring, hope, there's the hope that suffering will be relieved. And of course, sympathetic understanding. Sympathetic understanding, I think, is so critical, obviously, to dialogues. We use conflict resolution, has been forever using it, advocating sympathetic understanding. But it's a moral emotion. It's not just cognitive. Our field of peace building and the history of understanding ideology is way too focused on cognitive processes psychologically. And I think Richard Rubenstein's theme of tribalism, it's so obvious that, that the tendencies for groups to break into their tribe is so emotionally compelling, as indicated by a well-known theme that that teaching the other group the facts about history will have very little positive impact. That facts alone do not fact-checking do not underpin the tribalism. And I want to stress that this kind of tribalism is very clearly revealed in recent movements for human rights, for reversing racial injustice. We're seeing tribalism in many political spheres. I think it's very dangerous. And I'm sorry, and also the rage is very dangerous.
Just small note. Then I was listening to you. I was thinking about the use of rage in Russian, which is in Ukrainian is lut, and in Russian is yaroсть. And actually, the Soviet Revolution, so October Soviet Revolution, was very much promoted through this power of yaroсть. Like rage. It was very, very interesting, just thinking about it. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rothbart. It was very interesting, inspiring. If there are no questions, we can move to our